Welcome aboard the Strange Express. My name is Dr. Scherzo Stantio. On today's journey, we will travel back in time to an unusual camping trip by a couple of old friends. The name of the story is The Thing in the Graveyard. It'll involve a one-eyed cat, a graveyard, and an unknown entity. So take a seat and make yourself as uncomfortable as you can. The engineer has just signaled that we'll be on our way in a moment. Recently, I shared a story called The Vampire with you, and in it, the protagonist spent the night in the graveyard. When I read it, I thought, doesn't everybody? And I'm not referring to one's final destination either. The story brought back memories of when I was young and some of my friends and I got together to go camping with the express purpose of giving one of our number an experience that he would never forget. The victim, let's just call him Jim, and my two cohorts in this adventure, let's call them Timmy and John. This was back when we were in the 6th grade. We had study hall together, and we usually sat together and told each other stories. One day we were talking about ghosts, and each of us told our own ghost story if we had one. It came to be Jim's turn to tell a story, and he got up from the table and told us we were a bunch of sissies, and that there's no such thing as ghosts, and he had better things to do. He said he needed to go to his locker to get a book for his next class, and he hoped we had something more interesting to discuss in the future, and he left. Now I need to explain about Jim. Jim was a kind of crazy guy in those days. We had nicknamed him Blood and Guts. He once took a dare to jump from halfway up the high school stadium, which was about 20 feet from the ground. I thought for sure he was going to break his leg or his neck, but he did it and was unscathed. Outside of school, he is known to carry a hunting knife strapped to his leg, and when he asked what he wanted to be when he was older, he stated that he's going to be a mercenary. He was pretty cocky most of the time. After Jim had left the study hall, Tim, who was one of the class clowns and an all-round instigator, had a devious grin on his face, so I asked him, "What are you planning?" Tim looked at me and asked, "Don't you live near an old graveyard?" "Yes," I answered, "but no one's been buried there for years." As a matter of fact, at that time, it had been about 8 years since the last person was buried there. But most of the graves were from the 1930s. There's no fence around it, and it had truly became uncared for except for the county coming out and mow it once a month in the summer. Otherwise, it almost never had visitors, and no one kept it up. Even some of the gravestones had fallen over. Tim said that he thought we should put together a camping trip and spend the night in that graveyard. Tim asked me if there's a place where we could set up a tent. There is a place in the southeast corner that is not visible from the road, as there are lots of trees there, I answered. "Perfect," he said. "This will be a great opportunity to take old Blood and Guts down a notch or two. Here's my idea." He then explained how I could invite Jim over to camp out in the graveyard, but not tell him that he and John would be there too, and they would be able to do all kinds of things to scare Jim. I did not think that this was such a good idea. After all, Jim could be a loose cannon, and he was known for carrying knives, but Tim reassured me that they would be very careful and would not let the prank get out of hand. He said that he had ordered a blow-up ghost and Frankenstein's monster from a comic book, and this would be the perfect opportunity for him to test them out. All kinds of suggestions were made on how to throw a scare into Jim, such as mysterious noises, the shaking of the tent, and possibly some fireworks thrown in for good effect. And so plans were solidified to camp out in the graveyard one Friday night. Everyone, including Jim, were ready for the camp out in the old graveyard. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, things don't always go the way that they're planned. And as the fateful day approaches, the plan began to fall apart. When I got home from school that Friday, I went right out to set up the tent. It was a very large tent. It had been bought for a whole family to camp out in. I think it was large enough to hold 8 people, but it was the only tent that I had. It clearly was not designed to be set up by one person. So, I decided to wait for one of the other guys to get there to help me. After I got back to my house, John called me and he said he was not going to be able to make it. He said that his mother told him that he'd waited too late to ask, and she wanted to talk to my parents before she allowed him to spend the night at someone else's house. I wondered if he had told her about us camping in the graveyard. A little while later, Tim called me. He said that he wasn't going to be able to come over either, as he didn't have a ride. I had no way to come get him, as my dad was at work until late that evening, and he had our only car at the time. I was annoyed at Tim, as this was his brainchild. I only hoped that Jim would cancel too, but about that time, I heard a car honk in our driveway. I went out and met Jim, who had arrived with his dad. His dad gave us the usual advice to behave and have a good time, and as he is leaving, he said he'd be back and pick Jim up on Saturday afternoon. I led Jim over to where the tent was at, and we finished assembling it, and we went inside and opened up all the windows. Now, I don't think I mentioned it, but the tent stunk. We had owned the tent for several years, and once while camping it rained on the tent, and it started to leak in several places. My dad, well, I'll say was very thrifty, opted to coat the tent with some goop that he bought at the Army-Navy store, and was supposed to restore the waterproofing to tents. But it smelled really bad. In fact, it smelled so bad that it even repelled mosquitoes. Jim wrinkled his face and asked me, "Where did you bury the body?" Actually, it didn't smell like something dead, but it did have a very strong chemical smell, and it was not pleasant. Jim threw his gear down in one corner and said, "I'll take this room." We went back to my house and we did some tree climbing and exploring the woods that were nearby. Then we had supper. Now, we had corn on the cob that night from our garden, and I remember that Jim really packed it in and mentioned that he didn't often get fresh vegetables at his house. His father was a truck driver, and most of their meals were from frozen food, as his father, as a bonus, would sometimes be rewarded with a case of the product that he had hauled, which was usually frozen food. I presume this was all above board. After supper, we headed back to the tent, and it was now starting to get dark. The tent had aired out, so we closed the windows. "Well, what should we do first?" I asked. Jim said, "Well, if you don't mind, I think I'm going to take a nap. I always like taking a nap after having a good meal like the one your mom made." And he rolled out his sleeping bag and curled up and was shortly snoring very loudly. Now, my hobby was electronics, and this was in the dark ages before cell phones and personal computers. But I had brought my Radio Shack 50-in-1 science fair kit, so I went to work building things with it. After a couple hours, I got tired of listening to Jim snoring, so I built a little noise-making device of my own. It said at one level it sounded just like an insect buzzing. I added an extension cable to the kit so I could attach a speaker to it and move it closer to Jim's ear. I also found a nylon cord from my sleeping bag that had partially unraveled. So I maneuvered the buzzing speaker and the fuzzy cord close to his ear that was exposed, and just brushed his ear ever so lightly with the frazzled cord while moving the speaker back and forth to get the perfect effect of an insect flying around his ear. Unfortunately, Jim did not react in the way I expected. Instead of waking up just to see what was going on, he reached out and slapped his ear really hard. Then he sat up and asked me what the heck I was doing. I could not answer him right away as I was laughing too hard, and the sight of his very red ear made me laugh even harder. After we were both calmed down, he admired my handiwork and said he really believed a mosquito was lighting on his ear. His effects were very realistic. "Well, what should we do now?" I asked. Jim said, "I don't know. What can we do?" About that time, I thought I heard a cat faintly meowing in the distance. "I know. I tell you about the one-eyed cat. Don't tell me you're going to tell me another of your made-up stories." I told Jim, "This is a true story. This cat lived here for years, but she is very skittish. You would not see her more than a second or two, as she takes off in a flash." She has a very odd coloring. She's black, but has tinges of orange. First time I ever saw her, she had already lost one eye, and it was really grotesque, as the eye was just hanging down on her cheek. Apparently she'd been in a fight with some other animal, and the other animal had slashed her eye out. I wanted to help her, but you couldn't get close to her, and my parents warned me that I should not try to approach her, because she was a wild animal. I remember the eye hung down on her cheek for months, and it looked like tears dripping from the socket where the missing eye had belonged. Eventually the eye must have fallen off, as I no longer saw it on her cheek. I continued to see the one-eyed cat from time to time, often with some prey that it had caught. One day I was riding my bike along the side of the highway collecting returnable soft drink bottles to turn in for the deposit when I saw the body of the one-eyed cat in the ditch. It seemed she tried to cross the highway but did not make it. I was kind of sad. I didn't get too close, but I have no doubt that it was the one-eyed cat. It looked like her body was bloated and it was lying in the hot sun, but the black fur with the orange tinge was unmistakable. I returned home, and when my father came home from work, I told him that the one-eyed cat was dead, and I'd seen her in a drainage ditch next to the highway. He asked me to take him to her, as he said he would bury the body. He grabbed a shovel and we walked down to where I'd seen her, but she wasn't there. At first my father thought that I'd just not remembered the right place, and I told him that I was sure it was the right place. He then said that perhaps someone from the county had already spotted the body and buried it, as they sometimes do. So we went back to the house, and I didn't think about it again until a couple of weeks later, when I saw the one-eyed cat again out in our field behind our house. Jim said, "So you're saying the one-eyed cat is still alive?" "It would seem so," I said, "and unless I'm mistaken, it is just outside our tent right now." At that moment, we heard the cat make a loud, mournful meow. Jim said, "You aren't kidding, are you?" as the cat made another loud meow. At this, Jim peeked out the tent window. "It's a pretty big cat, isn't it?" I answered that it is fairly big, but it's pretty skinny. "Why, do you see it?" Jim answered, "I thought I did, but I'm not sure. If what I saw was it, it's pretty scary looking." "I don't think there's any danger," I answered, "as it seems to be afraid of people." "Why? What if it tries to come in?" Jim looked at me for a moment and replied, "Well, I guess I'll just go out your back door." I replied, "I have bad news for you. This tent does not have a back door." "Have you got a place where you want one?" Jim responded instantly. I chuckled and said, "What if it tries to come through the roof?" But before he could answer, and as though it could hear what I was saying and understood, the creature leaped up on the roof of the tent. I yelled, "We gotta get it off the roof. Its claws will punch holes in the roof, and my dad will use my hide to patch it." It seemed to take 2 minutes to get the zippers unzipped as they got hung up, and by the time we got outside, the cat was no longer on the roof. In fact, we looked around and we didn't see the cat anywhere, but it was pretty dark outside. I asked Jim if he saw anything, and he leaned over toward me and whispered, "I think I see something by the third tree from the left, but I don't think it's a cat." I looked over to see what he was looking at. Leaning against the tree was the outline of a human form. I could not tell if it was a man or a woman. It appeared to be wearing some kind of hood over its head, and it was completely black. Now my flashlight was inside the tent, so I asked Jim to keep an eye on the figure, and I would get my flashlight. Now in the back of my mind, I thought that it was either John or Tim, and they had made it after all. So I went inside the tent and found my flashlight. Now it was a pretty wimpy light. It's one of the old incandescent bulbs powered by 2 D-cell batteries. I went outside, and Jim said that it had not moved. So I turned on my light and pointed in the direction of the shadow figure. As soon as my light fell on it, the figure seemed to disappear. I don't mean that it ran away, I mean it just literally disappeared. I moved the light around, but it was nowhere around. I flipped the light back off, and all of a sudden, it seemed that the figure was back. Both Jim and I noticed that it seemed to be several feet closer to us than it was before. I turned to Jim and said, "I think we should get out of here. I'm going back to the house, and I'm going to camp out the rest of the night in my dad's station wagon." Jim replied, "Me too. Just don't get in my way unless you want my size 9 footprints on your back." We ran back to my house and stayed awake until sunrise in the back of my dad's station wagon. We did not want to go in the house as we would have been in trouble, and I may have not been able to have friends over in the future. We kept the doors locked, of course, and we talked about what we saw. And to this day, I really don't know what it was. It was really weird. You could see it when it was dark, but when I flashed the light on it, It seemed to be invisible. When we went back to the tent the next morning, nothing was missing. It didn't appear that anyone had messed with anything, which made it even more mysterious. Needless to say, I was now better friends with Jim. I have to admit that when I first met Jim, I didn't like him, as he seemed to be too full of himself and was a real blowhard. But that night in the graveyard, I learned that his bluster was a defense mechanism, and he was really a regular guy with a pretty good sense of humor. We never did figure out what it was that we saw in the cemetery that night. If you have any ideas, please post them in the comments. Well, it looks like we're once again approaching your station. As usual, I've been very happy to have your company for today's journey. Thanks again for watching, and come back again soon to take another trip on the Strange Express. In the meantime, happy rails to you.